The distant wail of a steam locomotive pierced the morning air as Ruby Zimmerman pressed her palms against the rough wood of her bedroom window frame, watching dust devils dance across the barren yard of her family's failing ranch outside Sweetwater, Texas. The year was 1879, and at 20 years old, Ruby had just discovered a truth that sent her world spinning like a tumbleweed in a gale. Her father had sold her to settle a debt. "You can't do this to me," Ruby whispered, her fingers trembling as she clutched the threadbare curtain. The floorboards behind her creaked, and she turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, eyes red-rimmed and downcast. "Your father has made his decision, Ruby. Mr. Sullivan will be arriving tomorrow to finalize everything." Her mother's voice cracked. "He's offering enough to save the ranch and keep your brothers fed through winter." Harlan Sullivan. Ruby's stomach twisted into a knot. Everyone in 3 counties knew of Sullivan's cruelty, a wealthy cattle baron whose first 2 wives had died under suspicious circumstances. "He's older than father, and they say enough," her mother hissed, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "Your father will hear you. What's done is done." Ruby sank onto her narrow bed, the weight of her future crushing down upon her shoulders. "So I'm to be sold like cattle to pay father's gambling debts," her mother's face hardened. "You'll have fine dresses, a proper house with glass windows. You'll want for nothing." "Except my freedom," Ruby whispered. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Ruby alone with the motes of dust dancing in the sunbeams, and a desperate plan forming in her mind. Night fell across the prairie, stars puncturing the vast darkness above the Zimmerman homestead. Ruby moved silently, packing a small bundle, a change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, the $10 she'd saved from selling eggs at the general store. It wasn't much, but perhaps it would be enough to get her to her aunt in Denver. As she eased her window open, a commotion erupted from the front of the house, men's voices, her father's drunken laughter. Ruby froze. It was too early for Sullivan to arrive unless plans had changed. Curiosity overcoming caution, Ruby crept down the narrow hallway, staying in the shadows. Through a crack in the door, she could see her father seated at the kitchen table with 3 men. A bottle of whiskey stood between them, and her father was counting a stack of bills. "So we're agreed then. $2,000 for the girl." The stranger's voice was smooth as silk, but there was something predatory in his tone that made Ruby's skin crawl. "She's worth twice that," her father slurred. "Pretty as a picture and untouched." The stranger, a tall man with a pockmarked face and expensive clothes, smiled coldly. "Sullivan said 1,500. I'm being generous at 2,000. "Sullivan," Ruby whispered to herself. This wasn't Sullivan, but someone acting on his behalf. "Deal," her father said, pushing the money across the table. "She's yours tomorrow at noon." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. She had to leave tonight now before dawn broke and they came for her. Backing away silently, she returned to her room, grabbed her bundle and slipped out the window into the cool Texas night. The prairie stretched before her, bathed in silver moonlight. Ruby headed for the road, keeping to the shadows of the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. She needed to reach town before daybreak, where the eastbound stage would pass through. If she could just get to Sweetwater, the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her diving into a thicket. A lone rider passed by, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. Ruby held her breath until he disappeared around the bend, then continued her flight, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Ruby's feet were blistered, her throat parched. The lights of Sweetwater appeared in the distance, a cluster of yellow pinpricks in the blue-gray light of early morning. The town was just stirring to life as Ruby slipped between buildings, avoiding the main street. The stagecoach wouldn't arrive until 10, and she needed a place to hide until then. The livery stable seemed the safest bet dark, full of hiding places, and the stableman, old Jim, was friendly. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," a familiar voice drawled as Ruby eased open the stable door. She whirled around to find Quinn Appleton leaning against a stall, arms crossed over his broad chest. He was tall and lean, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. Quinn had been the foreman at the neighboring Dixon Ranch until a year ago, when he'd left to try his luck further west. Rumors said he'd struck it rich in the silver mines of Colorado. "Quinn," Ruby breathed, relief and wariness mingling in her chest. "What are you doing back in Sweetwater?" "I could ask you the same thing, Miss Ruby," he said, pushing away from the stall. "It's barely dawn and you're sneaking around like a thief with that bundle." His eyes narrowed as he took in her dusty dress and wild hair. "You running from something?" Ruby hesitated. Quinn had always been kind to her, bringing her books from his travels and teaching her to shoot when her father wasn't looking. But he was also a man who played things close to the vest, keeping his own counsel and living by his own code. "My father sold me," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To Harlan Sullivan." Quinn's face darkened. "Sullivan, that snake." Ruby nodded, tears threatening to spill. "His man came last night with the money. They're coming for me at noon. I'm trying to catch the eastbound stage to Denver." Quinn was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. "Sullivan's in town." Ruby felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" "Arrived last night with 3 of his men. They're staying at the hotel." Quinn stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ruby, the stage won't leave until this afternoon. Sullivan will have the whole town looking for you by then." Desperation clawed at Ruby's throat. "Then I'm trapped." Quinn's eyes met hers, steady and determined. "Not necessarily." He glanced around the stable, then back at her. "I've got a proposition for you." Ruby stiffened. "I'm not looking to trade one master for another." A slow smile spread across Quinn's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Nothing like that. I'm heading back to Colorado tomorrow. I've got a ranch outside of Silver Creek. It's small, but it's growing. You could come with me as my housekeeper," he added quickly. "I'd pay you fair wages and Sullivan would never find you there." Hope flickered in Ruby's chest, but caution tempered it. "Why would you help me?" Quinn's expression softened. "Because no one should be sold like property, least of all you." He hesitated, then added, "And because I remember a girl who wanted more than this dusty little town could offer." Ruby studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Quinn Appleton had always been honest, sometimes brutally so, and right now he might be her only chance at freedom. "What's your plan?" she asked. Quinn's smile returned, this time with a hint of mischief. "First, we need to get you somewhere safe until we can leave. Then I need to have a word with your father." "My father?" "Quinn, that's too dangerous. If Sullivan's men let me worry about Sullivan," Quinn said, his voice hardening. "No one's going to hurt you, Ruby. I promise you that." Something in his tone made Ruby believe him. She nodded slowly. "All right, what do we do?" "Old Jim keeps a room above the stable. He's gone to visit his daughter in Fort Worth. You can hide there until nightfall." Quinn reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. "Get some rest. I'll bring you food later." Ruby took the key, her fingers brushing against his calloused palm. "Thank you," she whispered. Quinn nodded, his expression unreadable. "Lock the door behind you. Don't open it for anyone but me." As Quinn turned to leave, Ruby caught his arm. "Be careful. Sullivan's men are dangerous." A slow, confident smile spread across his face. "So am I, Miss Ruby. So am I." The room above the stable was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Ruby watched as Quinn strode purposefully toward the saloon, his tall figure drawing glances from the women sweeping their porches. Something about the set of his shoulders, the easy way he carried himself, spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin and capable of handling trouble. Ruby sank onto the bed, exhaustion washing over her like a wave. She hadn't slept at all the previous night, and the emotional toll of her situation was catching up with her. Despite her anxiety, her eyes grew heavy, and soon she drifted into a fitful sleep. She awoke to the sound of voices below, men's voices, angry and insistent. Ruby crept to the window, staying hidden behind the faded curtain. In the street below, her father stood with the pockmarked man from the night before, gesticulating wildly. A few paces away, a well-dressed man with silver-streaked hair watched the exchange with cold eyes. Even from a distance, Ruby recognized Harlan Sullivan. "You promised delivery today, Zimmerman," Sullivan's voice carried clearly in the still air. "I don't appreciate being kept waiting." "She's run off," her father said, his voice slurred even in the early afternoon. "But we'll find her. She can't have gone far." Sullivan stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "You'd better, or our deal is off and I'll want my money back with interest." Ruby's heart pounded so loudly she was certain they would hear it from the street below. As the men continued their heated discussion, she noticed Quinn approaching from the direction of the telegraph office. He moved with a casual confidence that belied the tension in his shoulders. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Quinn said, tipping his hat. "Seems like a serious conversation." Sullivan turned, his cold eyes assessing Quinn from head to boots. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy." "Well now, that depends." Quinn smiled, but there was steel behind it. "If you're talking about Ruby Zimmerman, then it concerns me a great deal." Her father squinted at Quinn, recognition slowly dawning. "Appleton, what business do you have with my daughter?" Quinn's stance shifted subtly, and Ruby noticed his right hand drifting closer to his holstered revolver. "I purchased your contract with Mr. Sullivan this morning." A stunned silence fell over the group. Sullivan recovered first, his face darkening with anger. "That's impossible. I made no such arrangement." Quinn reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "Telegraph from your lawyer in Austin, confirming the transfer of contract for the sum of $2,500. He handed the paper to Sullivan. "You can verify it yourself." Sullivan snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the contents. "This is preposterous." "I never authorized, your lawyer did," Quinn interrupted smoothly. "Seems he found my offer more attractive than yours. The money's already been transferred to your account in Austin." Ruby's father looked bewildered, glancing between the two men. "What does this mean?" "It means," Quinn said, his voice hard as iron, "that your debt to Mr. Sullivan is settled, and your contract regarding Ruby has been transferred to me." He turned to Sullivan. "Unless you'd like to contest it legally." Sullivan's face contorted with rage, but something calculating entered his eyes. "How did you know about our arrangement, Appleton?" Quinn shrugged. "Sweetwater's a small town. People talk." His hand still hovered near his gun. "Now, I believe our business is concluded." Sullivan stared at Quinn for a long moment, then folded the telegram and tucked it into his coat. "This isn't over, Appleton." "For today it is," Quinn replied evenly. With a curt nod to Ruby's father, Sullivan turned and stalked toward the hotel, his men falling in behind him. Ruby's father stood swaying slightly, confusion and alcohol clouding his features. "What happens now?" he asked Quinn. "Now you go home, Zimmerman," Quinn said coldly. "Consider your debt paid and your daughter no longer your concern." As her father shuffled away, Quinn glanced up at the stable window. Though Ruby was hidden behind the curtain, she felt his gaze find her, and a small nod of reassurance passed between them. Ruby sank to the floor beneath the window, her mind spinning. Had Quinn really purchased her contract? Was she now legally bound to him instead of Sullivan? The thought sent a complex mixture of emotions churning through her: relief that she had escaped Sullivan, gratitude toward Quinn, but also apprehension about what he might expect from her in return. The sound of boots on the stairs brought Ruby to her feet. A soft knock followed. "Ruby, it's Quinn." She opened the door to find him standing there, hat in hand, his expression grave. "You heard," Ruby nodded. "Did you really buy my contract?" Quinn stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "No, that was a bluff. A bluff. But the telegram was from my business partner about a horse sale," Quinn said with a wry smile. "Sullivan was too angry to read it carefully, and your father was too drunk to question it. But it won't hold for long. Sullivan will check with his lawyer, and when he discovers the truth—" He shook his head. "We need to leave tonight." Relief washed over Ruby. "So I'm not bound to you by contract." Quinn's eyes met hers, clear and honest. "No, Ruby, you're not bound to anyone. My offer stands: a job at my ranch, fair wages, and your freedom. Or I can help you get to Denver to your aunt. The choice is yours." Ruby studied him, this man who had risked himself to help her. "Why did you do it? Stand up to Sullivan like that?" Something flickered across Quinn's face, an emotion Ruby couldn't quite name. "Let's just say I have no love for men who treat women as property." He hesitated, then added, "And I've always had a high regard for you, Miss Ruby." A warmth spread through Ruby's chest at his words. In all her 20 years, no one had ever stood up for her the way Quinn Appleton had today. "When do we leave?" she asked. Quinn's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "After dark. I've got 2 horses ready at the edge of town. Pack light. We'll be riding hard until we're well out of Sullivan's reach." As night fell over Sweetwater, Ruby and Quinn slipped from the stable, keeping to the shadows. The town was quiet, most of its citizens gathered at the saloon or tucked into their homes for the evening. "Sullivan's men are watching the roads," Quinn whispered as they crept behind the general store. "But they won't expect us to head north through Miller's Pass." Ruby followed him closely, her heart racing with every sound. The bundle containing her few possessions bumped against her back, a reminder of how little she was taking from her old life. They reached the edge of town without incident, where 2 horses waited, tethered to a post near the creek. Quinn helped Ruby mount a sleek chestnut mare before swinging into the saddle of his own black gelding. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice low. "If there's trouble, ride hard for the pass. Don't wait for me." Ruby nodded, though she silently vowed not to abandon him if trouble came. They set off at a walk, keeping to the softer ground beside the road to muffle the sound of hoofbeats. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on black cloth. As they put distance between themselves and Sweetwater, Ruby felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was truly free, riding toward an unknown future of her own choosing. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when the sound of pursuit reached them, hoofbeats pounding on the hard-packed road behind them. "Ride," Quinn commanded, spurring his horse into a gallop. Ruby bent low over her mare's neck, urging the animal faster. The wind whipped tears from her eyes as they raced across the moonlit prairie, the thunder of pursuit growing louder behind them. The entrance to Miller's Pass loomed ahead, a narrow gap between towering rock formations that rose from the plains like sentinels. Once inside, the winding trail would be difficult for anyone unfamiliar with its twists and turns. "Almost there," Quinn called over the rush of wind. A shot cracked through the night, the bullet whistling past Ruby's ear. She gasped but kept riding, fear lending her strength as they plunged into the darkness of the pass. The trail narrowed, forcing them to slow to a trot. The sounds of pursuit echoed off the rock walls, making it impossible to tell how close their hunters were. "This way," Quinn whispered, guiding his horse off the main trail onto a nearly invisible path that wound upward through the rocks. They climbed higher, the horses picking their way carefully over the rough terrain. After what seemed like hours, they emerged onto a small plateau hidden from the main trail. Below, they could see 3 riders searching the pass, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. "Sullivan's men," Quinn muttered. "They'll search until dawn, then head back to report." Ruby shivered, partly from the cool night air and partly from the realization of how close they had come to capture. "What happens if they catch us?" Quinn's expression was grim in the moonlight. "They won't take you back to Sullivan, if that's what you're asking. A man like that doesn't tolerate being crossed. They'd likely kill me and—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice what might happen to Ruby. "Then we'd better not get caught," she said with more confidence than she felt. Quinn's face softened into a smile. "No, madam, we certainly won't." He dismounted and helped Ruby down from her horse. "We'll rest here until they give up. There's a cave further back that offers shelter." The cave was shallow but dry, with enough room for both of them and a small fire. Quinn worked quickly, gathering bits of deadwood and building a fire small enough not to be seen from below but large enough to provide warmth. Ruby sank down gratefully near the flames, exhaustion settling into her bones. Quinn handed her a strip of jerky and a canteen of water from his saddlebag. "It's not much of a supper," he apologized. "It's perfect," Ruby replied, suddenly ravenous. As she ate, she studied Quinn in the flickering firelight. There was something different about him since he'd left Sweetwater a year ago, a confidence, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "You've changed," she observed. Quinn looked up, surprised. "Have I? You seem older, more sure of yourself," he chuckled softly. "A year in the mountains will do that to a man, makes you figure out what matters." "And what matters to Quinn Appleton?" Ruby asked, genuinely curious. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Freedom," he finally said. "The right to choose your own path." His eyes met hers across the fire. "The same thing that matters to you, I reckon." Ruby nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I never thought I'd get the chance to find out what freedom feels like." "You will now," Quinn promised. "No one's going to force you to do anything you don't want to do, not while I'm around." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Ruby. She had known Quinn for years, as her neighbor's foreman had admired his skill with horses and his quiet competence. But this protective side was new, or perhaps she was only now seeing it clearly. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back sudden tears, "for risking everything for me." Quinn shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got 3 days hard riding ahead of us, and Sullivan isn't a man to give up easily." "Then we'll face it together," Ruby said firmly. A slow smile spread across Quinn's face, warming his eyes. "Together it is, Miss Ruby." As the night deepened around them, the search party eventually gave up and retreated down the pass. Ruby and Quinn took turns keeping watch, each grabbing a few hours of restless sleep before dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of gold and crimson. They set out early, following the hidden trail through the pass until it rejoined a little-used track that led northward. Quinn set a grueling pace, pushing the horses as hard as he dared while keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. By midday, they had left the rocky terrain behind and were crossing rolling grasslands dotted with stands of cottonwood and aspen. The June sun beat down mercilessly, and Ruby's cotton dress stuck to her skin with sweat. "We'll stop at the next creek," Quinn promised, noticing her discomfort. "The horses need water, and we could both use a rest." The creek, when they reached it an hour later, was a ribbon of cool water cutting through a small valley. Cottonwoods provided blessed shade, and the grassy banks offered a perfect spot to rest. The horses drank deeply while Quinn refilled their canteens. Ruby splashed water on her face and neck, sighing with relief as the cool liquid washed away some of the dust and heat. When she looked up, she caught Quinn watching her, an unreadable expression in his blue eyes. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he replied quickly, turning his attention back to the horses. "Just thinking you're holding up better than most men I've ridden with." Ruby laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Appleton?" "Highest kind," he assured her with a grin. "Most city folks would be complaining by now about saddle sores and sunburn." "I'm no city girl," Ruby reminded him. "I've been riding since before I could walk." Quinn nodded, his expression growing more serious. "That's one of the things I always admired about you, Ruby. You're not afraid of hard work or a little discomfort." The compliment warmed her more than she cared to admit. They ate a simple lunch of jerky and hard biscuits, then rested in the shade for an hour before continuing their journey. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The rolling grasslands gave way to more rugged terrain, with rocky outcroppings and deeper valleys. The air grew cooler as they gradually climbed higher. "We'll make camp in that grove ahead," Quinn said, as the sun dipped toward the horizon. "It's sheltered, and there's a spring nearby." The grove proved to be a perfect campsite, a circle of pines surrounding a small clearing, with a spring-fed pool at one edge. Quinn tended to the horses while Ruby gathered wood for a fire. They worked together with the easy rhythm of people accustomed to frontier life, each anticipating the other's needs without needing to speak. As darkness fell, they sat beside the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across their faces. The night was cool enough for Ruby to pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Cold?" Quinn asked, noticing the gesture. "A little," she admitted. Without a word, Quinn shrugged out of his coat and draped it around her shoulders. The garment was warm from his body and carried his scent leather, tobacco, and something uniquely him. "Thank you," Ruby murmured, pulling the coat closer. "Won't you be cold?" Quinn shook his head. "I've got the fire." He hesitated, then added, "And I grew accustomed to colder nights in the mountains." "Tell me about your ranch," Ruby said, genuinely curious about the life Quinn had built for himself in Colorado. Pride crept into Quinn's voice as he described his property, 300 acres in a valley near Silver Creek, with a sturdy cabin, a barn, and corrals for his horses. He had 20 head of cattle, 6 breeding mares, and plans to expand once he returned from this trip to Texas. "It's not much compared to the big spreads," he admitted, "but it's mine free and clear. No debts, no partners." "It sounds wonderful," Ruby said softly. "A place of your own, built with your own hands." Quinn nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That was always the dream ever since I was a boy working other men's land." He glanced at her. "What about you? What was your dream before?" He trailed off, not wanting to remind her of the circumstances that had thrown them together. Ruby considered the question, realizing that no one had ever asked her about her dreams before. "I wanted to teach," she finally said. "I've always loved books, learning. The school teacher in Sweetwater, Miss Henderson, let me help with the younger children sometimes. She said I had a gift for it." "You'd make a fine teacher," Quinn said, his voice warm with approval. "Silver Creek's growing. They're looking for a schoolteacher come fall." The implication hung in the air between them that Ruby might stay in Silver Creek, build a life there. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. She had never imagined a future beyond the confines of her father's ranch, and suddenly possibilities stretched before her like an open road. "One day at a time," she murmured, more to herself than to Quinn. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. One day at a time, he agreed. They fell into a comfortable silence, the crackle of the fire and the night sounds of the wilderness creating a peaceful backdrop. Ruby felt her eyelids growing heavy, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her. "Get some sleep," Quinn said gently. "I'll take first watch." Ruby didn't argue, spreading her bedroll near the fire and lying down with Quinn's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. Despite the hard ground and the unfamiliar surroundings, she fell asleep almost instantly, feeling safer than she had in years. She awoke to Quinn's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "Ruby, wake up. We need to move." The sky was still dark, though a faint glow on the eastern horizon suggested dawn wasn't far off. Ruby sat up, instantly alert. "What is it, riders?" Quinn said grimly. "Coming up the valley." Could be Sullivan's men, could be trouble of another kind. Either way, I'd rather not find out. They packed quickly, working by touch more than sight. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving through the pre-dawn darkness, following a game trail that led higher into the hills. "If we can reach Cottonwood Pass by nightfall, we'll be in Colorado territory," Quinn explained as they rode. "Sullivan's influence doesn't extend that far north." The trail was treacherous in the dim light, forcing them to move slowly despite the potential pursuit. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, Ruby could see the tension in Quinn's shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. "You think they're still following us?" she asked when they paused to rest the horses at midday. Quinn's expression was grim. "Sullivan's not a man to give up easily, especially when his pride is wounded, and we're leaving a trail a blind man could follow." Ruby glanced back at the way they had come, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. "What can we do?" "Keep moving," Quinn said simply. "And hope we're faster." They pushed on through the afternoon, the terrain growing increasingly difficult. The horses were tiring, their pace slowing despite Quinn's urging. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they crested a ridge and looked down into a narrow valley. "Cottonwood Creek," Quinn said with evident relief. "The pass is just beyond. Once we cross it, we'll be in Colorado." They had just started down the slope when the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Ruby's horse reared, nearly throwing her as dirt kicked up just inches from its hooves. "Ride," Quinn shouted, spurring his gelding down the slope. Ruby followed, clinging to her saddle as they galloped recklessly toward the creek. More shots rang out behind them, bullets whizzing past with terrifying proximity. They splashed across the shallow creek and pounded up the opposite bank, heading for the shelter of a stand of pines. Just as they reached the tree line, Ruby heard Quinn grunt in pain. She looked over to see him slumping in his saddle, one hand pressed to his side. "Quinn," she cried, reining in beside him. "Keep going," he gritted out, his face pale beneath his tan. "The pass is just ahead." "Not without you," Ruby said firmly, dismounting and reaching for his reins. Blood was seeping between Quinn's fingers where he clutched his side. With Ruby's help, he slid from the saddle, staggering slightly as his boots hit the ground. "We need cover," he gasped, glancing back toward the creek where their pursuers would soon appear. Ruby scanned their surroundings, her mind racing. "There," she said, pointing to a jumble of boulders set against the hillside. "Can you make it?" Quinn nodded grimly, leaning on Ruby as they led the horses into the shelter of the rocks. The formation created a natural fortress, with a small cave-like space at its center just large enough for them to hide in. Once inside, Ruby helped Quinn sit with his back against the rock wall. His shirt was soaked with blood on the right side, just above his hip. "Let me see," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as she gently pulled his hand away from the wound. The bullet had torn through his flesh, leaving an ugly furrow across his side. It was bleeding heavily, but Ruby could see that it wasn't immediately life-threatening. The bullet had passed clean through without hitting any vital organs. "It's not as bad as it looks," Quinn said through clenched teeth, clearly trying to reassure her. "Bad enough," Ruby replied, tearing a strip from her petticoat to use as a bandage. "Hold still." She worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could with water from their canteen, then binding it tightly with the makeshift bandage. Quinn remained silent throughout, though sweat beaded on his forehead from the pain. "Thank you," he said when she had finished, his voice rough. "Don't thank me yet," Ruby said, peering out through a gap in the rocks. "They're coming." 4 riders were crossing the creek, moving slowly as they searched for signs of their quarry. Ruby recognized the pockmarked man who had come to her father's house, along with 3 rough-looking cowboys she didn't know. Sullivan himself wasn't among them. How many? Quinn asked, trying to shift into a better position to see. 4, Ruby whispered. "Sullivan's men." Quinn's hand moved to his holster, drawing his revolver. "They'll find our tracks soon enough." Ruby's mind raced, searching for a solution. They couldn't outrun the pursuers, not with Quinn injured. Fighting was an option, but the odds were poor. 4 armed men against Quinn, wounded, and Ruby with no weapon. An idea struck her. "The horses," she whispered. "If I set them loose, they might draw the men away." Quinn hesitated, clearly reluctant to risk her safety. "It's too dangerous." "More dangerous to stay here and be found," Ruby countered. After a moment's consideration, Quinn nodded. "Be careful. Don't let them see you." Ruby crept back to where they had tethered the horses, keeping low behind the rocks. The animals were nervous, sensing the tension. She untied them quickly, then slapped the chestnut mare hard on the rump. Both horses bolted, crashing through the underbrush and out into the open valley. The sudden movement caught the attention of Sullivan's men, who wheeled their mounts and gave chase, assuming Quinn and Ruby were attempting to escape. Ruby hurried back to Quinn's side, her heart pounding. It worked. They're following the horses. Relief washed over Quinn's face. "Quick thinking," he said with approval. "But they'll be back once they realize the horses are riderless." "Then we need to be gone before that happens," Ruby said, determination hardening her voice. "Can you walk?" Quinn grimaced but nodded. "With help." Ruby took as much of his weight as she could, supporting him as they emerged from their hiding place. The pass was less than a mile away, a notch in the ridge that marked the border between Texas and Colorado territory. On foot, with Quinn injured, it would be a difficult journey, but their only chance at escape. They moved slowly, staying within the tree line for cover. Quinn's face grew paler with each step, but he made no complaint, his jaw set with determination. Ruby admired his strength, even as she worried about the toll the exertion was taking on his wound. The sun was setting by the time they reached the base of the pass, painting the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. Behind them, distant shouts indicated that Sullivan's men had discovered their ruse and were returning to search the area. "We need to hurry," Ruby urged, helping Quinn over a fallen log. "Leave me," he gasped, his breathing labored. "You can make it on your own. I'm slowing you down." Ruby fixed him with a fierce glare. "I'm not leaving you, Quinn Appleton, not after everything you've done for me." Something flashed in his eyes, surprise, followed by a warmth that had nothing to do with his fever. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, but there was admiration in his tone. They pushed on, the climb growing steeper as they ascended the pass. Darkness fell around them, making the journey even more treacherous. Ruby was exhausted, her muscles screaming with the effort of supporting Quinn's weight, but she refused to stop. The sound of pursuit grew more distant behind them, suggesting that Sullivan's men were searching in the wrong direction. But Ruby knew their luck wouldn't hold forever. They needed to cross the pass before dawn brought clearer visibility. Just when she thought her strength would fail, the ground leveled out beneath their feet. They had reached the top of the pass. Before them, the land fell away into Colorado territory, a vast expanse of wilderness bathed in silver moonlight. "We made it," Ruby breathed, tears of relief stinging her eyes. Quinn straightened slightly, some of the tension leaving his body. "Not quite yet. We need to get down the other side before they think to check the pass." The descent was faster but no less dangerous, with loose shale threatening to send them sliding down the steep slope. By the time they reached the bottom, both were exhausted beyond measure. Quinn's bandage was soaked through with fresh blood, and he was leaning heavily on Ruby, his face gray with pain. "We need to rest," Ruby insisted, guiding him to a sheltered spot beneath a large pine. Quinn didn't argue, a sign of how badly he was hurting. He sank down with his back against the tree trunk, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Ruby knelt beside him, rewrapping his wound with the last clean strip of her petticoat. "How far to Silver Creek from here?" she asked, trying to keep him talking focused. 2 days' ride," Quinn answered, his voice weak. "Longer on foot." Ruby bit her lip, worry gnawing at her. Without horses, with Quinn injured, their situation was dire. They had escaped Sullivan's men for the moment, but they were now stranded in the wilderness with minimal supplies and no transportation. "We'll figure it out in the morning," she said with more confidence than she felt. "For now, you need to rest." Quinn's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers squeezing gently. "You're something else, Ruby Zimmerman," he murmured. "Braver than any man I've ever known." The simple compliment warmed Ruby through and through. She settled beside him, sharing her body heat as the night grew colder. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her, her mind racing with worries about the future and the man beside her whose life now rested in her hands. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Colorado mountains, revealing a landscape of breathtaking beauty, pine-covered slopes, meadows carpeted with wildflowers, and in the distance, the silver ribbon of a river winding through a valley. Under different circumstances, Ruby would have been awestruck by the scenery. Now, she regarded it with practical eyes, assessing their options. Quinn had developed a fever during the night, his skin hot to the touch despite the cool mountain air. The wound wasn't showing signs of infection yet, but Ruby knew that could change quickly without proper care. "We need to find help," she said, more to herself than to Quinn, who drifted in and out of consciousness. During one of his lucid moments, Quinn pointed toward the river. "Trapper's cabin," he managed to say. "About 5 miles downstream, old man named Fergus, friend." It was their best hope. Ruby fashioned a crude travois from pine branches and her shawl, creating a drag stretcher that would allow her to pull Quinn rather than support his weight. It was slow, exhausting work, but she refused to give up. They followed the river valley, Ruby stopping frequently to rest and check on Quinn. His fever was worsening, and he muttered incoherently during their stops, sometimes calling for his mother, sometimes speaking to people Ruby didn't know. During one such rest, as Ruby bathed Quinn's forehead with cool water from the river, his eyes opened, startlingly clear and focused. "Ruby," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in hours. "If I don't make it, don't say that," she interrupted fiercely. "You're going to be fine." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn," he murmured. "But listen. If something happens to me, head northeast from the cabin. 3 days' walk will bring you to Silver Creek. Ask for Sheriff Wade. Tell him what happened. He'll help you." Ruby nodded, though she had no intention of going anywhere without Quinn. "I understand. But you're going to make it, Quinn Appleton. I didn't drag you this far just to lose you now." His smile widened slightly. "Yes, madam," he whispered before drifting back to sleep. Ruby resumed their journey with renewed determination. By mid-afternoon, she caught sight of smoke rising above the trees ahead a chimney, she hoped, belonging to the trapper's cabin Quinn had mentioned. The small log structure appeared as she rounded a bend in the river, a sturdy cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by stretches of drying firs. An older man with a long gray beard was splitting wood in the yard, his back to Ruby as she approached. "Hello," she called, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "Please, we need help." The man turned, startled, then dropped his axe and hurried toward her when he saw Quinn on the travois. "Good Lord, girl, what happened?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. "He's been shot," Ruby explained quickly. "Are you Fergus? Quinn said you were a friend." "Aye, that I am," the old man confirmed, kneeling to examine Quinn. "Quinn Appleton, what trouble have you gotten yourself into now?" he muttered, though Quinn was too far gone to answer. With Fergus's help, they carried Quinn into the cabin and laid him on a narrow bed. The trapper examined the wound with experienced hands, his expression grave. "Bullets gone clean through, which is a blessing," he said, "but he's lost a lot of blood and the fever's got a hold on him. I've got some herbs that might help, but—" He trailed off, looking at Ruby with sympathetic eyes. "He's going to live," Ruby said firmly, refusing to consider any other possibility. Fergus nodded, seeming to respect her determination. "We'll do what we can, lass. First thing is to clean that wound properly and get some medicine into him." For the next 3 days, Ruby barely left Quinn's side. She helped Fergus change the poultices of herbs he placed on the wound, spooned broth between Quinn's cracked lips, and bathed his burning skin with cool cloths. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she thought of all Quinn had risked to save her from Sullivan, and found new reserves of strength. On the 4th morning, Ruby awoke from a brief sleep to find Quinn's eyes open, clear and aware for the first time since they'd reached the cabin. "You're still here," he said, his voice weak but steady. Relief flooded through Ruby, bringing tears to her eyes. "Where else would I be?" she asked, taking his hand in hers. "Thought maybe I'd dreamed you," Quinn admitted. "Or that you'd come to your senses and headed for Silver Creek without me." Ruby shook her head. "Not a chance, Mr. Appleton." A slow smile spread across his face. "I'm beginning to see that, Miss Zimmerman." Fergus pronounced Quinn on the mend, though it would be weeks before he was strong enough to travel to his ranch. Ruby sent a message to Silver Creek with a passing fur trader, letting Quinn's foreman know what had happened and that they were safe. As Quinn's strength returned, Ruby found herself wondering what would happen next. The immediate danger from Sullivan had passed. They were well beyond his reach now, but her future remained uncertain. Quinn had offered her a position as his housekeeper, but as they spent their days talking, laughing, and learning more about each other, Ruby began to wonder if that was all he wanted from her. One evening, as they sat on a bench outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and pink, Quinn turned to Ruby with an unusually serious expression. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what happens when we reach Silver Creek." Ruby's heart quickened. "Oh." "The offer of a job at my ranch still stands," Quinn said carefully, "but I'm wondering if perhaps—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Perhaps what?" Ruby prompted gently. Quinn took a deep breath. "Perhaps you might consider a more permanent arrangement." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. "What sort of arrangement?" "Marriage," Quinn said simply. "I know it's sudden, and you barely know me, but—" "I know you," Ruby interrupted softly. "I know you're the kind of man who would risk his life to save a woman he barely knew from a terrible fate. I know you're honest and kind and brave," she smiled, her eyes meeting his. "I know enough, Quinn Appleton." Hope dawned in Quinn's blue eyes. "Is that a yes?" Ruby's smile widened. "It's a yes." The joy that transformed Quinn's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Despite his still healing wound, he pulled Ruby into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that promised a future brighter than either could have imagined just weeks before. They were married 2 weeks later in Silver Creek, with Sheriff Wade officiating and Fergus standing as Quinn's best man. Ruby wore a simple blue dress that matched Quinn's eyes and carried wildflowers picked from the meadow near their new home. The ranch Quinn had described during their journey proved even more beautiful than Ruby had imagined, a sturdy log house nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered mountains, with a creek running clear and cold through the property. Horses grazed in fenced pastures, and a small herd of cattle dotted the hillsides. "Welcome home, Mrs. Appleton," Quinn said as he carried Ruby across the threshold of their house. The words filled Ruby with a joy she had never thought to experience. From a life of hardship and the threat of being sold to a cruel man, she had found her way to freedom and love in the arms of a man who saw her as an equal, not a possession. As summer turned to fall, Quinn's wound healed completely, leaving only a scar to remind them of their harrowing journey. Ruby took on the role of ranch mistress with enthusiasm, bringing order and warmth to Quinn's bachelor home. In town, she began helping at the school, working toward her dream of becoming a teacher. News reached them occasionally of happenings back in Texas. Harlan Sullivan had reportedly died of apoplexy after a confrontation with a cattle rustler, his empire crumbling without his iron hand to guide it. Ruby's father had lost the ranch, driven to ruin by his drinking and gambling. Her brothers had moved west to California, while her mother had gone to live with relatives in St. Louis. Ruby felt a pang of sadness for the family she had left behind, but no regret for the choice she had made. The life she shared with Quinn was everything she had ever wanted but never dared to hope for, filled with hard work. Yes, but also with laughter, respect, and a love that deepened with each passing day. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in their cozy home, Quinn presented Ruby with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Open it and see," Quinn urged, his eyes twinkling with anticipation. Inside was a leather-bound book, a journal with blank pages, and a beautiful fountain pen. "For your stories," Quinn explained. "You have a way with words, Ruby. I thought maybe you might want to write them down, share them with others someday." Touched beyond measure by his thoughtfulness, Ruby leaned over to kiss him tenderly. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips. As they broke apart, Quinn placed a hand gently on Ruby's stomach, which had just begun to show the first signs of the child they were expecting in the summer. "Our child will need stories," he said softly. "Stories about brave women who forge their own paths, who refuse to be owned or controlled." Ruby covered his hand with hers, tears of happiness pricking her eyes. "And about honorable men who stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." Quinn smiled, pulling her close against his side as the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside their window. "We've got plenty of stories to tell, Mrs. Appleton, and a lifetime to tell them." "A lifetime," Ruby agreed, resting her head on his shoulder and feeling, for perhaps the first time in her life, completely at peace. In the years that followed, their family grew, first with the birth of their son, James, in the summer of 1880, followed by twins, Elizabeth and William, 2 years later. The ranch prospered under Quinn's careful management and Ruby's practical support, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the valley. Ruby eventually became the schoolteacher in Silver Creek, sharing her love of learning with not only her own children, but with all the young minds in their growing community. In the evenings, she wrote stories in the journal Quinn had given her, tales of courage, freedom, and love that were eventually published in newspapers and magazines across the West. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Ruby would remember that desperate night when she had fled her father's house, terrified of the fate that awaited her as Harlan Sullivan's unwilling bride. The memory no longer brought fear, only gratitude for the twist of fate that had placed Quinn Appleton in her path at precisely the right moment. "Penny for your thoughts," Quinn said one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains. Ruby smiled, taking his hand in hers. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't come back to Sweetwater when you did." Quinn brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I like to think we would have found each other somehow, Ruby. Some things are just meant to be." Looking at the life they had built together, their thriving ranch, their beautiful children, the love that had only deepened with time, Ruby knew he was right. Their story was one of courage and chance, of a woman who refused to be sold and a man brave enough to stand against cruelty. But more than that, it was a story of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed: freedom, respect, and a love that would last a lifetime. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ruby leaned her head against Quinn's shoulder, content in the knowledge that their greatest adventure, their life together, was still unfolding, one day at a time, in this beautiful corner of the Colorado wilderness they now called home.